So, Simon, when we're thinking about this general election campaign and the media, is there anything that stands out to you as particularly different from previous general election campaigns?
Well, I think it's really interesting this time that this is a general election where we seem to know what the result is going to be. So we've got a media that aren't really very influencing of the public, and they're not going to make a huge difference. The newspapers in particular, typically are right-wing papers. You look at the Telegraph, the Mail, the Sun, the Express, they're obviously more pro-Tory than they are Labour, but I think even they recognise that they have very little influence. I think the really key change as well is if you look at something like the Sun always say, we're backing a winner. This year, obviously, it looks like it's going to be Labour, but the Sun have actually sat on their hands and haven't announced who they're going to back. It wouldn't surprise me if they do eventually say, we're going to back Labour very cautiously. But you've also got to remember things like Rebecca Brooks is the chief executive of News UK, which owns The Sun and The Times, and she was prosecuted in the phone hacking days by Keir Starmer during his time at the Crown Prosecution Service. So there is a lot of animosity there and long memories. So the other thing to really say with the media at the moment, especially the newspapers, is actually they don't have a lot of influence anymore.
Yeah.
So the average age of a newspaper reader these days is 65. Which explains why they always talk about pensions and savings and tax in those spaces. And young people just don't get their news from newspapers anymore. So I think the really interesting thing to see is where are the younger people getting their news from, and how are they being influenced, and how can the parties engage with that audience, because they can't engage through the newspapers as they may have done in the past.
So, do you think there are any parties that are doing better than others at engaging beyond traditional media and looking at some of those platforms that younger people do engage with a little bit more?
Well, certainly this campaign is very social media driven, and you can micro-target a lot more, and you can target specific seats, which all the parties are doing much more successfully than ever before. And I think that's just a recognition that young people are not engaging with traditional forms of media, so they're going to social media instead. I think the other really interesting thing with the traditional media this time round is that we don't have the traditional media going after the Labour Party in particular in quite the same way they did in previous elections. If you think back to Corbyn and you think back to Ed Miliband, I mean, the Daily Mail, for example, if you remember, really went to town on Ed Miliband and his dad and his history. And then obviously with Corbyn, they all thoroughly disliked the man. And it's very noticeable with Keir Starmer, they've not gone after him in quite the same way. I think the main reason for that is because they see what's coming, potentially, if the polls are right, and most people think they are. And these newspapers are going to have to continue having a relationship with the Labour Party as a party in government. And I think that it's very noticeable that they are having to pull their punches and try and build a steady, strong relationship with them, because they don't want to be seen as completely irrelevant when young people are getting their information elsewhere, and political parties are looking at other ways to reach the public more widely.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes me think, actually, I'm curious to ask what you think about the ways the media has been covering the Conservatives campaign this time around. We've spoken about Labour, because something that I've seen and heard said a lot is that to some extent, perhaps some of the right-wing outlets are insulating the Conservatives from just how badly some elements of their campaign appear to have been going. Is that something that you'd agree with?
I think so, to some extent. I think actually what's more interesting about the way the newspapers are covering the Conservatives campaign is they kind of ignored the election in quite a lot of ways. I think the fact we've got the Euros taking place is in some ways really helped some of those newspapers, because it's a really good distraction from the general election. In terms of the Tories and the covering of their side of things and how it's going, it tends to be more about how can they use the Tory attack lines on Labour and spin them. So obviously tax has had cut through.
Absolutely.
The supermajority has had cut through. But clearly the Tories have not covered themselves in glory. We look at D-Day, and Rishi Sunak's decision there played really badly. And you look back to even the beginning, I mean, everyone felt quite sorry for him when he got rained on like that. But I think, was it day 2, he went to Belfast on the Titanic exhibition? And whoever's advising him maybe wants to have a bit of a think, because I think some places just not thought it through.
Yeah. And to contrast that then, I've also seen a lot of comments, much more favourable comments generally, on Ed Davies' media rounds this campaign. And he's been doing some quite interesting and quite out there things in places. What are your thoughts on that?
So Ed Davies is interesting because I think the media traditionally are very sceptical and quite sneering almost in places. And the natural inclination when you see Ed Davies falling off a waterboard or going on a roller coaster and saying there's lots of ups and downs and swings and we're going to have the biggest swings and all of those stunts that sort of define the Lib Dems now. I think actually in this campaign there has been some cut through, and I think that the media's traditional sneering attitude has actually not been taken up by the public. I think especially Ed Davies talking so personally about his son and the disabilities that his son has and the impact that has on him, I think has really cut through.